Hello everyone again. I'm excited to finally be sharing what I've been doing for my research project. Throughout my time at Liberty, I've focused on studying American communism and anti-communism, so it only made sense to explore Christian attitudes toward communism and the Soviet Union in the post-war era for my project. My paper investigates the anti-communist attitudes of Presbyterians during the first 20 years of the Cold War, and it begins with a brief overview of the more broadly held Presbyterian attitudes and later delves into the sort of varying perspectives held by prominent Presbyterian preachers, such as Carl McIntyre and Eugene Carson Blake, but also public figures and politicians like Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles. It'll also go into some of what was published in the Presbyterian Guardian by different contributors in a more journalistic sense. And so the different attitudes are going to be analyzed and compared and contrasted to identify the common threads. And then I take out all the kind of more marginal ideas and kind of toy with those to paint a picture of the spectrum of Presbyterian attitudes toward Cold War communism and the Soviet Union. So while the general Christian attitude toward Cold War communism in the Soviet Union was that communism and socialism are fundamentally incompatible with Christianity and democracy, within specific denominations, like Presbyterianism, individuals, institutions, and churches espoused varying degrees of anti-communist attitudes. While a few prominent figures led the charge against godless communism, maybe encouraging more vigorous opposition, like Carl McIntyre, the more commonly held beliefs were comprised of a few main beliefs. First, communism isn't evil, but its believers and citizens are still sons and daughters of God. 2, Christians in the church must work to fight communism both at home and abroad. And 3, Christians should guard their hearts against communism's penetrating ideology, and furthermore, against the fascist loss of freedom that could come from hypervigilance. One stance early on in the post-war period was that of John P. Cleland. He wrote a piece called "Should the Church Fight Communism?" in 1947, and while he debated about what the church's role should be, as some churches abroad had chosen to actually resist communist revolutions, he said that the Christian must oppose and hate and fight communism. But he questioned the role of the church and its involvement in anti-communist activity, as opposed to just the spiritual side of things. John A. Mackay and Glenn W. Moore in 1953 sent a letter to the Presbyterian congregation. It's kind of referred to as the Presbyterian letter. It outlined 2 main threats to America. 1, the menace of communism, and 2, the fanatical negativism as a response to the communist threat. It warned about a spiritual vacuum that, quote, "our national house, cleansed of one demon, would invite by its very emptiness the entrance of 7 others. In the case of a national crisis, this emptiness could, in the high-sounding name of security, be occupied with ease by a fascist tyranny." This goes along with what some others were thinking. Ultimately, the letter called for 2 things. Number 1, hate communism. Number 2, guard oneself against hating individuals or nations as a whole. That will run counter to some of what we hear Carl McIntyre say, but I won't get a huge chance in this video to get into. So basically the letter balanced anti-communism and anti-McCarthyism, and we'll see that also in Blake's speech that was broadcast on the radio in 1961, called "The Church and Communism." The problem, he stated, was that people argued that the church had been infiltrated by communists. McCarthyist vigilantism had reached the church, and in Blake's words, played into the communist hands. The solution, he argued, was to caution against going on the defense. Instead, churches should fight to protect the United States from anti-communists. So threat number 1, just like we saw in the letter, is communism. Threat number 2 is a more internal threat. The vigilantism could diminish the freedom of Americans in the same way that communism had done, and the totalitarianism that went with it had done to its constituents. Then things kind of turned to Karl McIntyre. Karl McIntyre, as we've seen in the history of the Presbyterian Church, takes a different approach, which is where we got the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, and later breaking even more from that to the Bible Presbyterian Church. And he was more vigorous in his appeal to fight communism. He wrote in a pamphlet called Why Christians Should Fight Communism that the Christian is and must be the most valiant warrior against godless communism in the 20th century, and should lead the fight to win the Cold War, and should do so in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. This is more of a battle cry as opposed to a spiritual one. Karl McIntyre espoused that people should take a more active role in fighting communism, not just the ideology, but those who believed in it as well, which departs slightly from the greater framework of ideas. For the sake of this video, I didn't have enough time to touch on the attitudes of other prominent Presbyterian political figures like Eisenhower and Dulles, but Eisenhower's creation of the Judeo-Christian nation and the unification of the American people around their faiths to fight godless communism took many forms, and some Christians were more likely to see the similarity of socialism to some of Jesus' teachings, while others focused on the totalitarian and materialistic threat of an atheistic ideology, as they should. Some went so far as to consider communism a religion, and many of its followers believed it in that way, with that intensity. But ultimately, no matter where everyone's thoughts kind of fell, and Presbyterians had more of an interesting sort of map of thoughts, which I'll outline in my paper, but President Eisenhower summed it up really well in 1952, saying, "Our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." This goes back to our liberty biblical worldviews too. In that God, Jesus Christ, is central in human history. This faith is central to American democracy, and that principle really shined through to me.